Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 6 of our road grader build. Well, as I said last week at the end of the show, we are really in the home stretch now. I don't want to talk too much today because we still have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it and head over to the bench. Well, it's now time to make the seat. So for the seat base, it's a very simple table saw cut. It's a little smaller, 3/4 of an inch thick, 1 inch by 1.25 inches, and that is it. Seat base is done. As far as the rest of it, I like to make the seats out of scrap. So this is an old piece of walnut that was sitting in there. This side here is still rough cut. It's not even on this side. So I've cut these to their final dimension squares. All I'm going to do really is I'm going to mark out on these pieces on one side, scaling from the drawing, I'm going to mark out the profiles. And then using that same method that we used in order to shape our blade holders with that double-sided tape, being able to attach it to the square block, and then using the square block to shape our piece at the belt sander, that's exactly what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to get these pieces shaped up, and then I will show you how our seat looks. And there we go, with the chair shaped and a little bit of a laser embellishment added on it, we can now glue it centered on the back wall of our cab. Well, it's now time to make one of the most despised things on the model. It's something that I really don't like doing, but it's part of the model and we have to do it. You can buy them store-bought, but that's just not what I do. And what I'm talking about is the steering wheel. I found this piece of walnut up in the rack. It's just a piece of junk. It's got a piece of 1/4 inch hardboard or MDF glued to it. This shape, I don't even remember what I used it for or what an offcut was or what it's an offcut from, but I saved it for some reason, and apparently it was for a steering wheel. So that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use this for a steering wheel, at least get something out of it. So the very first thing that I want to do with this is I want to cut this down to 1 inch in, let's say 1 5/8 inches by 1 5/8 inches square. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the center, and right in that center, I'm going to drill a 1/4 inch through hole. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to try to get this MDF off of here. So we're just going to try to split it off of the walnut. Oh, well, that was tough. Hardly even held on there. All right, that works for me. So we'll clean up the rest of this MDF. And then we're going to take it over to the lathe, and I'm going to mount this on a pen mandrel. And with that done, the very first thing that we want to do to this is turn it round and then turn it down to a diameter of 1 1/4 inches. Well, with our final dimension turned, I want to now work on the hub or the back of the steering wheel. So what I'm going to do is get a detail chisel and just work my way back towards this knurled nut here and try to carve it out to be the back of the steering wheel. So our whole steering wheel is really only 7/16 deep. Right there. So the steering wheel itself is 1/8. So at this point, with this back hub pretty much shaped, I'm going to get back in here with that detailing gouge, and I'm going to shape the rest of the steering wheel. I know that it's not going to be perfect, but there's more to do than just lathe work on this. Now what you're trying to accomplish here is rounding this steering wheel outside as well as making the interior kind of concave. It can be finicky, but just take your time. And if you're going to be trying this on the lathe, you know what? It's a piece of scrap. So what a great way to practice. And if you should nail it, then you've got a great looking steering wheel. So let me get this finished up and I'll show you what we end up with here at the lathe. Well, once I got the shape down to the way that I want it, what I do is I end up actually getting in there with a very thin parting tool, and I part it just until it separates from the shaft. And this is what you end up with. Now, this isn't complete yet, because I like to take it a little bit further. While it was on the lathe, I drew the inner and the outer circles here of this, both the steering wheel and the hub. And what we're going to do, let's take this over to the bench and I'll show you how I mark this out. Well, from here it's all kind of guesswork, and I need to separate, or at least draw a few lines here so that I can make the hub separate from the steering wheel. So we're just going to do our best here to try to line things up. And I'm just placing marks from the lines that I drew while it was still attached on the lathe. And I'm just extending lines out to represent pieces of the hub. It's not an exact science at all. You kind of just got to keep working at it until you get it the way you like it. Okay, you know what? And that's not too bad there. I don't really like this bottom one, but I can change it. So what we're going to do now is drill blade entry holes here, here, and here. And believe it or not, I'm going to take this over to the scroll saw and I'm going to cut those sections out. And once you get the scrolling done, you end up with this. And there still is some shaping to do. We're going to get in here with some sandpaper and try to soften up these edges. You don't have to make the steering wheel completely round, but you should soften them a little bit. I'm also going to try to take a chisel and I'll just try to gently trim down these arms here to make them a little less flat across the top. And then using one of our 3/16 pins that we made earlier, we can just pin this to our steering column to allow the wheel to still turn. We're going to trim it down so it doesn't protrude so much. And that will be the steering wheel done. So let me get the shaping done and I'll show you what we ended up with. All right, and with our seat in there and our steering column and our steering wheel looking good, we are going to place our roof on here, and we can glue this in place now because there is nothing else to add to the interior. So let's get this roof glued on and then we can move on. Well, we're now going to make the ladders. We have to make 2 of them. It's one of the smaller accessories on the model. And for that, I have a scrap piece of walnut. It's 1/4 of an inch thick, but we need to rip some 1/16 inch wide strips off of this. Now, the safest way to do this is on the exterior of the blade. So what you want to do is on the end of your piece, mark the 1/16, then adjust your fence so that it will have the 1/16 on the offcut, on the outside of the blade. Once you're happy that it's aligned, you can use push sticks to run it through, and you should end up with the right size piece. Well, what I would suggest is at each end of one of your strips, just because you have the length to do it, I would cut this 20-degree angle right here on the uprights of your ladders. You'll make 4 of them, so 1 in each end of your strips, and then guys, use your miter box to cut these. You can get accurate lengths of your rungs. They're 7/8 of an inch long each. You can get accurate cuts by using a stop block to do it. Cut these, and then I'll show you how to glue them together once you have all of your pieces. All right, so step 1, I have given these a very light sanding just on their surfaces with the sandpaper attached to the MDF. I have a setup block here that I know has a square edge. We're just going to apply a little bit of glue to the end of one of our ladder rungs, and then holding our upright just like this, we're going to line this up, and using our block, our setup block, we're going to glue our rung into place. Now we're going to try to line up the ends perfectly there. It looks like we've done a good job of it. So there you go. We are going to let that sit there and completely dry. Okay, step 2. Once these are dry, take your 3/4 inch setup block, and if you don't have 3/4 setup blocks, you can just cut a piece of 3/4 stock. We're going to line it up there against our bottom rung, because according to the plans, each one of these rungs has a 3/4 inch space between it. Take a little bit of glue, and same process, up against the block and push it into place. Now, just like we did before, put that aside. Don't touch it. Let that dry. And once that is dry, we can pop this spacer out of here. But up here I've glued it in a little, but that's okay. It'll release. And we will now repeat the process. We'll place our spacer there and glue our third and final rung with our 3/4 spacer in place. We'll glue that to our ladder. And just like before, leave that alone. Let it completely dry. Well, in order to finish off our ladders, we will apply glue to the ends of each of the rungs. We will lay our ladder down and place our 3/4 spacer blocks in between our rungs, just to make sure the spacing is right. And then making sure that your angle of your side rails is the same. Don't accidentally glue it on backwards. Use a straight edge to line things up and just push it together in place like this. And now we can let this sit, and once again, like I've said through this whole ladder assembly, let it completely cure. Don't touch it, just leave it alone. Go do something else. Well, now that your ladders are completely dry, you can give them a final sanding, just gently, back and forth on your sandpaper on the MDF. It will take away any of the imperfect edges and make them, well, you know what, perfect. There you go, look at that. We'll even give it a little bit on the top here. And there you go. There are your ladders. Doesn't that look great? Well, in order to make the blade for your road grader, it looks like a confusing piece to make, but you just need to take your time and take certain precautions. So I'm going to try to explain it as best I can and see what we make out. So I have my blank cut to 1 inch by 2 inch by 16 inches long, and I also have, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this on the show before, but on my throat plate of my table saw, I always have this black line here. Sometimes it fades out and I redraw it, but that represents the dead center of the arbor of my blade. And that way, when I'm raising my blade to a certain height, I don't know, 1/4 inch or what have you, I know that that is the highest point of the blade, and I'm going to get an accurate reading. So what I have done here is I've redrawn it just to make it a lot more clear. And we need to put a fence on the table. It's an auxiliary fence. We're not going to use our miter gauge, but I'm able to adjust the miter gauge here to the degree that I need. We need this auxiliary fence at 16 degrees to the blade. So the way you want to do this is I have marked the center of our board here, and what you want to do is line up your fence so that when the blade strikes the wood, it is going to strike it in the dead center of your board. Now, if you move your fence too far close to your blade, you'll see it striking too far to the one side. Too far away will strike it too far to the outer edge. So you want it to strike in the middle, just like that. Now, what I have done is, after I am happy with the setting, I've taken a pencil line. I'm not sure if it's going to show on camera, but I have drawn a pencil line using my fence as the ruler guide. I have drawn a pencil line here to guide me where to clamp my fence. And what I'm going to use, quite some time ago on the show, we made this large shop-made tapering jig. So I am going to line this up with my lines that I've placed on the table saw and the throat plate itself, and I'm going to securely clamp this in place. Okay, I have raised my blade's height to 1/16 of an inch. I have also marked here a line across the top and on the other side as well, 5/8 an inch up from the bottom. That is the top of the arc that we want to cut here on this blade. So we're going to run it through. Do not take off more than a 1/16 at a time. We're going to just very slowly run this through. Don't rush it. You'll get better results if you take it slow, and be sure to use push pads, guys. One thing that I forgot to mention is that if you have a riving knife in here, remove it, because that riving knife is going to stop your cut from traveling any further along. It's going to make a mess of it. So you need to get that riving knife out of there as well. With that first pass made, we will raise our blade another 1/16 of an inch, and we will take another pass. So we will continue this process all the way along. Raise the blade a 1/16 of an inch, take a pass, 1/16 of an inch, take a pass, and carry on until you get the blade and your arch up here, your cove, up to that 5/8 line that you placed on your stock. And while it's a time-consuming process, you end up with some great results. Look at that cove. That looks amazing. All right, so let's get the rest of the cuts done to finish off the blade of our road grader. Well, if we look here on the drawing, we can see that right at the top edge of the blade, we have 1/32 of an inch less. So the very first thing we're going to do is, at the table saw, set the fence to cut that 1/32 off the entire bottom of our blade. Our next cut will be to place our cove against the fence and rip this piece down to its final thickness of 13/16 of an inch. We've now tilted our blade to 45 degrees, and on one edge, we've measured in 5/8 of an inch. And right at that mark, we are going to cut this section off at 45 degrees. Well, for this next cut, you can scale off the drawing if you want, but for me, remember those brackets that we made earlier? We made a left and a right one much earlier in this series. These are the brackets that mount this to your road grader. So I would be using these brackets to judge the measurements as to where to make the next cut, and then we can carefully push through. You just want to make sure that when you're pushing this through, don't apply your pressure back here on the 45. You want to get something like this, a wooden push stick, to push it through to keep your pressure on the one flat spot left at the bottom of our blade. And now with our top of our grater blade against the fence and with our flat section here down against the table, we're going to set our fence at 1 11/16. And we're going to run this through and cut it to its final dimension. And the very last thing to do here is to square off the one end, and then we're going to cut this to its final length of 11 inches. Well, we can now put the blade assembly together. So I have our lower disc here, and I have our blade mounts, the left and the right. I have labeled this here as the front so that I know what's going on. That's what that arrow is. And I've also labeled it as the bottom. So we have this upside down at the moment, and you can see the orientation of the blade mounts. So what we're going to do is we're going to glue this in place so that the front of our arches line up with this circle. And once that's dry, we can mount our blade centered on here. So we can just get that in place, centered, just like this. And we can glue that and clamp it in place and let it dry. And with your blade assembly finished, you should have something that looks like this. And we've given it a good sanding all over, leveled out any uneven surfaces, and we can now glue it in place here. So I've placed a little plastic washer with a 3/16 hole, just like we have for any of our other moving parts on the model. And we're going to place a little bit of glue into the center hole right here. And then we will sit our blade assembly in place over top of that dowel. And we'll let that set up. Well, up until now, our upright cylinders have been just free floating. So what we can do at this point is we can glue them in place. I've placed a mark there where they go, and where you want to glue them, you want to make it so that there is 1 9/16 of an inch protruding out of the top of the cylinder mounting brackets. So right there, just like that. So we can clean up the squeeze out, and then that will be those pieces mounted in place where they go. Well, just because it isn't on the plans doesn't mean you can't have a little bit of fun. And I have done another little embellishment here with the laser. I've designed the engraving file, and I've cut these little under the contract too, and then the city. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount these squarely on the side of each cab, and I have one for the rear of our road grader, and I think that they'll just be another little added accent just to give a little more realism, because every time I've seen one of these things, it's always under contract to somebody. And now while we're at it, we can mount our ladders in place, making sure, again guys, use squares, use setup blocks, use whatever you can to make this so that everything lines up perfectly. On smaller scales, any imperfections really stand out. So there we go, there's one ladder mounted in place. Just take away the setup block and the square. I'll clean up the squeeze out, and then we can mount the one on the opposite side. And once again, unfortunately, we've run out of time again this week. Guys, what a load of progress we have made on this week's show, and the model is really looking to be in its final stages. And I'm actually hoping to wrap it up probably in next week's show. It's been, well, this is 6 weeks now. It's been a 6-week journey, but what a load of fun, and I hope that you guys are enjoying it as well. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. You click that bell and then you're not going to miss the notifications of future episodes of the show. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you've enjoyed the content. I hope that this show or this series is providing you the confidence to try your own model in your own shop. And more importantly, guys, I hope that you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.